So this is the American Solidarity Party of Washington, and we are pleased to host Professor Powers, and he's going to share with us about a Catholic peace-building approach to U.S. foreign policy. So we're very pleased that you could join us, Professor Powers.
Okay. Thanks, John, and thank you all for joining this conversation at a really bad time for you. 6 p.m. is not the best time. I understand that. I'm really delighted to meet all of you. I was introduced to the American Solidarity Party about 6 or 7 years ago, and I read the platform, and I have to say it's the first political party platform that I read that where I agreed on virtually everything in it. And I meet with a group of about a dozen guys, mostly faculty members from the University of Notre Dame and Holy Cross College and St. Mary's and some other institutions in this area. And virtually everyone shares my opinion of the American Solidarity Party. So that's just a really interesting, I like the consistent ethic approach that you take to policy, because I've always felt like I'm without a party home. I've often been reluctantly a charter member of the write-in party for the lack of a political party home. So good to be with you. So I tell my students that truth is one of the most important values we're in international affairs, and the lack of truth is one of the biggest problems. And so let me admit that I lied a little bit to Stouty when we talked about doing this. He originally asked me to do something on the just war tradition. And I said, well, why don't we broaden it out to talk about Catholic peace building more generally and how that might contribute to U.S. foreign policy. But when I sat down to write some remarks for this event, I decided to go with a bit more with his original request. And so what I'd like to do is, in the first part, talk about more national security related issues that are tied to a Catholic approach, my specialty, a Catholic approach to the ethics of war and peace. And then in the second part, I will talk a little less, but briefly about a number of peace building issues that I think are relevant. And we can spend more time on the peace building issues or any other issues that I didn't talk about when we have a time for discussion. So if you don't mind, I do have some prepared remarks. And so let me begin with those, and then we can, I don't think it'll take too long. We begin with, then we'll have a conversation. So the first, US muscular unilateralism is a term that some people have used to describe US foreign policy. And I think it's appropriate basically to describe US foreign policy since the end of World War II, which has tended to be over-militarized. And that over-militarization is tied to an assumption that the US is and should be the dominant military, political, economic, and cultural force in the world. And so I think the Solidarity Party is correct in stating that administrations of both parties have pursued a policy of reckless overreach at great cost to both ourselves and other nations. That over-militarization, what the party calls the reckless overreach, has been most evident in the fact that since the invasion of Grenada in 1983, the US has been engaged in almost perpetual war. The immoral and illegal military intervention in Iraq in 2003, which was justified morally and politically by the Bush administration's dangerous doctrine of preventive war, represented the zenith of what some have called this muscular unilateralism. The disaster in Syria and the tragic end of the longest war in US history this past August in Afghanistan represent the bitter and predictable fruits of this over-militarized approach to solving the world's problems. And as a nation that is over-militarized, it's not surprising that we see that in our military budget. President Biden recently signed the $768 billion defense bill, a 5% increase over last year, and 25 billion more than he and the Pentagon requested. That's 39% of total global military spending. 39% of total global military spending is the US military spending. And that US military spending is more than the next 10 largest military budgets combined, all put together. So when it seemed necessary, and it often wasn't necessary or deemed necessary, to provide a moral rationale for this overly militarized approach and bloated military budgets, proponents relied on a permissive approach to the just war tradition. This permissive approach sees force as a means to defend and promote justice, one tool in the foreign policy toolbox. It tends to focus on worst case scenarios when talking about the threats that we face and that justify force, but ideal case speculation about the positive consequences of going to war. Official Catholic teaching on war for most of the past century, and certainly since the Second Vatican Council, has taken a very different approach to the ethics of military force. Starting with a strong presumption against war, it takes a highly restrictive approach to interpreting the just war criteria. This approach has led the US bishops, for example, to have been deeply skeptical about the morality of virtually every US military intervention since the Vietnam War. And this restrictive approach recognizes that the use of force rarely achieves the justice, sustainable peace, and freedom that is so often promised when our country decides to go to war. Now, let me say a few words about an issue that does not get the attention that it once did. When I was in graduate school in the early 1980s, this was the dominant issue. And it doesn't get the attention it still deserves, and that is nuclear weapons. Today, the world is really schizophrenic on nukes. One sign of the nuclear times is positive. Nuclear stockpiles have been reduced by some 85% since the height of the Cold War. That's 85% since the height of the Cold War. That would have been unimaginable in the early 1980s or even the mid 1980s that we would ever achieve those kinds of deep reductions. At the time, we were just hoping to freeze nuclear weapons. Nobody thought it was realistic to reduce them. So that's a huge achievement. A host of former nuclear hawks, like Henry Kissinger, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, George Shultz, former Secretary of State, who just died, Sam Nunn, former longtime head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, have used their influence to promote efforts to achieve global zero. In 2017, 122 countries signed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and that treaty went into effect in 2021. The Vatican was one of the first countries to sign and ratify the nuclear ban, which means that the Swiss Guards now will have to continue to rely on their halberds, swords, and pikes to defend the Pope. No nukes allowed. But those positive developments are counteracted by very different nuclear signs of the times, and signs which reflect much more of a return to the Cold War type dynamics that we lived under for so long. The United States and other nuclear powers are in the midst of the biggest nuclear modernization program since the early 1980s. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the US will spend over $634 billion on new nuclear weapons this decade, and that price tag could rise to $2 trillion, almost $2 trillion over the next 25 years. Hardly anyone is paying attention to this. Certainly not the way people paid attention to the Reagan nuclear buildup in the early 80s, but it's equally significant. The arms control regime is on life support. The US withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in Europe, and the Iran Agreement, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty remains unratified by the US and other key nations. While the risk of global nuclear war is nowhere near what it was during the Cold War, arguably the risk of nuclear use is as great as ever. Now, the Biden administration, fortunately, and one of the first things it did was renew the critically important New START agreement, which is the only remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. And in general, the Biden administration is far more serious about nuclear arms control than the Trump administration was, or the Bush administration was. But Joe Cirincione, a prominent nuclear expert, calls Biden's nuclear policy Trump light. Trump light, because it will likely keep in place, he argues, most of the planned nuclear modernization programs, and probably will not endorse key policies supported by the Solidarity Party, such as adopting a no first use posture. So amidst the world's schizophrenia on nukes, where's the Catholic Church? It really is at a decisive moment in its engagement on this issue. Pope Francis has been unequivocal in condemning not only the use of nuclear weapons, but also nuclear deterrence. So the nuclear deterrence is what's gotten the attention, as well as in continuing to call for nuclear disarmament. Now, key bishops in Europe and the United States have criticized the Pope's rejection of deterrence, but I would argue that the Pope's position is not a significant departure from his predecessors, and we can discuss why if you'd like in the Q's and A's. So the Church's position is very as clear as it ever has been on the need for nuclear disarmament. But the Catholic community has some work to do. As the Church condemns nuclear deterrence and calls for nuclear disarmament, it has to address two gaps if it wants to succeed in shaping the moral debate and democratizing what is mostly an elite debate. The first gap is an ethics gap. If nuclear deterrence is immoral, what are the policy and pastoral implications of that? Archbishop Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where two of the major nuclear labs are based, and where the first atomic bombs were developed and tested, issued a very interesting pastoral letter about 2 weeks ago, about 50 pages long. I've seen nothing like it by any individual bishops or even a bishops' conference in decades. And he spent a good part of that letter focusing on nukes next door, nukes in my backyard, how the nuclear weapons industry, the role that his archdiocese plays in that, and the impact that it has on the archdiocese. It's a very, and he's calling for people who work at these labs to either quit their jobs or he's calling for these labs to give up their nuclear weapons work or use their nuclear weapons expertise to get involved in nuclear disarmament efforts or in green energy and other kinds of research. But his pastoral raises a lot of very challenging questions about the responsibility of, Catholic parliamentarians or members of Congress, for example, who vote on a defense budget every year that includes substantial monies for not only maintaining the nuclear deterrent, but vastly modernizing, in some respects, expanding it. What do you say to all those Catholics in the military who command some element of the nuclear military? Can Catholics vote for politicians who support maintaining a strong nuclear deterrent or support the major monies being spent on nuclear weapons right now? And if nuclear disarmament, the other part of the ethics gap is if nuclear disarmament is a moral imperative, a lot of work has to be done on the moral challenges that arise if the world ever actually approaches and achieves that global zero that the Church and others are calling for. We really need to develop an ethic of non-proliferation and an ethic of disarmament that's equivalent in sophistication to what was produced during the Cold War on the ethics of use and deterrence. For example, what would a world near or at zero make the world safe for conventional war? Or must nuclear disarmament coincide with conventional disarmament in order to avoid that possibility? How do we achieve the Church's vision of an international order marked by cooperative security? There's also, with the ethics gap, in addition to the ethics gap, there's a capacity gap. The Vatican, the US, the Japanese bishops have consistently addressed the nuclear issue since the end of the Cold War, but few other bishops' conferences have. Since the end of the Cold War, most bishops' conferences, most church leaders, as well as most Catholic scholars, have moved on to other issues. And so we're in a situation where we really have to help empower a new generation of Catholic leaders, bishops, ethicists, lay leaders, opinion makers, youth, to be able to make a distinctive contribution to the ethical and policy debate on nuclear disarmament. And in order to help in the small way to do that, we here at Notre Dame at the Kroc Institute, through the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, which I coordinate, started in 2014 a project on revitalizing Catholic engagement on nuclear disarmament. And we're working with the US bishops, Georgetown, Berkeley Center, the International Federation of Catholic Universities, Catholic University of America, and some others to try to help revive the Catholic engagement on nukes. So that's the first part of my talk on some of the sort of national security issues and how the church's teaching on ethics of use of force might apply. Now let me move briefly to some peace building, some broader peace building issues that relate to US foreign policy. The Solidarity Party's platform could be considered a nice summary of a Catholic approach to international affairs. It says that this party is committed to policies which will bring about a more peaceful world through international cooperation and prudent restraint in the use of military force. Peace is not just an absence of war, but the positive presence of justice and charity among people and among nations. And the US should use its diplomatic influence and soft power to promote an international order that respects the dignity of the human person. Now, the highly restrictive approach to the just war tradition that I mentioned earlier is intimately tied to what could be called an ethic of peace building. And that ethic of peace building has several components. The goal, as the Solidarity Party notes, is a positive peace, a just peace based on promoting integral human development, integral ecology. A peace building ethic rejects the narrow forms of nationalism in favor of the national security approaches to international affairs in favor of a human-centric cosmopolitan vision of cooperative security. It recognizes the growing effectiveness of nonviolence in world affairs. Exhibit A is the fact that the Cold War ended and the Soviet bloc and even the Soviet Union dissolved with hardly a shot being fired. And Pope John Paul II and many religious actors in Central and Eastern Europe played a key role in that peaceful end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. A peace building ethic strongly supports the strengthening of international norms and institutions. It does not seek to get the US out of the UN or the UN out of the US. The United States has and can play a key role in contributing to a peace building ethic or a just peace. It's played a key role in mediating peace accords. Well-known examples, Senator Mitchell, President Clinton, and their role in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland in 1998, which is hanging by a thread, but has largely been a successful agreement. Senator Danforth and President Bush played a key role in an accord that led to the creation of South Sudan. South Sudan has turned out to be a bit of a disaster in terms of the conflict, but few people thought that that kind of a peace agreement that you could break up Sudan and give South Sudan independence would be able to be done peacefully. But the Bush administration played a key role in making sure that happened. And the United States has played an important role in supporting the Columbia Peace Accord, which was signed 5 years ago. And Notre Dame's Kroc Institute, where I teach, is the first entity ever to be assigned the official role of monitoring implementation of that peace accord. We've got about 36 full-time people in Columbia and here in Notre Dame who are monitoring that accord and issue regular reports on progress. The United States remains a beacon for human rights and democracy around the world. I know that because through the Catholic Peacebuilding Network and my work before that with the US bishops, we work with church people all over the world, and they might not like US policy in many respects, especially US national security policy or economic policies, but they do tend to see the United States as an example of human rights and democracy, one of the best examples. But obviously, given recent events, especially January 6, 2021, that's now in jeopardy. And we really have to get our own house in order if we're going to continue to have that sort of positive role on human rights and democracy in the world. At least be an example of that for people. The United States has historically been the largest provider of humanitarian and development aid. That remains a tiny percentage of the US budget. And we could do much better, but we have done some remarkable things through that humanitarian development aid. The Bush administration's work on huge effort on AIDS and other diseases is a good example of that. Let me raise one issue where the US has not played such a great role, and that is in mining. We just came out with I mentioned this for self-serving reasons. We just came out with the Catholic Peacebuilding Network came out with a new book last week. It's available free, open access book, free online, called Catholic Peacebuilding and Mining. And we tried to look at the important role the Catholic Church is playing on the mining issue in many places around the world. And it's really an interesting role that the Catholic community is playing. But mining and oil are seen by a lot of countries and promoted by other countries like the US, the World Bank, the IMF, as a quick way to solve problems of underdevelopment. In Colombia, for example, right now, the government and a lot of international actors are counting on expansion of mining to help bring the peace dividend to go with the peace accord. And too often, these countries suffer from the resource curse. These resources, these extractive industries, don't bring the development, the widespread development that everyone is hoping for, but instead drive corruption, line the pockets of dictators, create environmental disasters, and contribute to violent conflict. And one solution to climate change, clean energy, electric cars, I'm putting solar panels on my house in a few months, is likely to exacerbate these problems since the minerals needed for those batteries and solar panels come from places like Congo, which has suffered one of the world's most deadly conflicts over the past 3 decades. And its rich mineral resources are very much at the center of those conflicts and contribute to those conflicts. There have been some good positive pieces of legislation, especially the Dodd-Frank legislation and other initiatives that seek to bring some degree of transparency to the supply chains. But US policy tends to support the mining and oil behemoths that dominate these industries without much regard for some of the wider consequences, negative consequences. Finally, US policy can always do more to take religion seriously in its foreign policy making. If you think about the peace accords around the world, the Catholic community and other religious actors often play key roles. A new book just came out by one of the world's experts in peace accords who argued that religious language in peace accords contributes to stronger peace accords that are more effective. The San Egidio community, the lay Catholic community based in Rome, but it's worldwide, famous for mediating and facilitating the Mozambique peace accord in the early 1990s, is now the official facilitator of the peace negotiations involving the government and the rebel actors in South Sudan. And the Sudan Council of Churches, which includes the Roman Catholics, the Anglicans, and other Christian churches in South Sudan, has long played a key role at all forms of peace building in South Sudan, one of the major actors there. In Colombia, the priest who heads Caritas Colombia and the National Social Pastoral, which is their National Peace and Justice Office for the bishops, he chairs the official National Peace Commission that was created by the peace accords. That represents all the key actors, civil society, government, rebel groups, everybody in Colombia. He's the chair. Another priest chairs the official Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Congo, the Congolese bishops, after many failed efforts by the African Union, regional governments, the UN, the Catholic bishops were asked to try to facilitate negotiations between President Kabila and the political opposition. After quite a while trying to do that, that failed. But when they had elections a couple of years ago, the Catholic bishops organized this incredible election monitoring effort involving tens of thousands of people around the country. And this is a country that has about fewer than 500 miles of paved roads, has very poor communications. But through this amazing effort, they organized tens of thousands of people to monitor the elections. And the UN, the official monitoring body of the AU and the UN, declared the elections basically legitimate. The bishops, however, had much better information because they relied on their presence throughout the country, and they said the elections were fraudulent. And the UN, the New York Times, and virtually everyone quoted the Congolese bishops' judgment about the elections, not the official monitoring body, because it was so good. So those are just a few examples of how the Catholic community and many and other religious communities really play a key role in really important events. And there's some efforts, there have been efforts by the US State Department to engage religion in a more sophisticated way. The most well-known are around religious liberty with the International Religious Freedom Act that was passed in 1998. And the US bishops are very supportive of that. So the US is quite good compared to other governments on religious freedom abroad. But they aren't, the US has not been as good in a consistent way on looking at the role that religion can play in promoting peace around the world. You had under the Obama administration, you probably had the best effort ever to do that. They had quite a large and sophisticated bureau or office at the State Department that did look at the role that religion plays in peace building. But that now has largely been abandoned. So let me conclude with a survey the UN recently did. The question was, would you please give your honest opinion about solutions to the shortage of peace in the rest of the world? Would you please give your honest opinion about solutions to the shortage of peace in the rest of the world? The survey was a huge failure. In Africa, they didn't know what solutions meant. In Europe, they didn't know what shortage meant. In China, they didn't know what opinion meant. In the Middle East, they didn't know what peace meant. In the US, they didn't know what the rest of the world meant. The US has incredible influence in the rest of the world, but most Americans and many of our political leaders have incredibly parochial perspectives. They don't know or much care, frankly, what the rest of the world means. And that is a sin of commission. It's a failure to take moral responsibility for the impact, both positive and negative, especially negative, of our governmental policies, our corporate policies, our culture, our lifestyles on the rest of the world. And it's also a sin of omission because it's a failure of solidarity, to be in solidarity with the world that desperately needs the best of American ideals and the best of what the United States can offer. And I think the Solidarity Party recognizes that there's an awful lot that Americans can do to use our influence and power to make the world a more just, free, and peaceful place. That's why I'm glad to be talking to you tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Powers. Should we open it up to questions? If you have a
Sure,
question,
yeah.
go ahead.
Please.
So if you have a question, go ahead and you can turn your video on and ask the professor. I had a question. I didn't know about, you mentioned the Columbia Peace Accords that Notre Dame is involved in. What is that?
Well, when they were finishing up, finalizing the accords, they needed somebody to monitor implementation. And normally that would go to the UN or the some regional governmental body. But the Kroc Institute and the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, whose secretariat is at the Kroc Institute, had long been involved in Colombia in one way or another. And so someone recommended that the Kroc Institute they couldn't agree on other bodies, and somebody recommended the Kroc Institute, and most people didn't know what the Kroc Institute or Notre Dame was. So we figured it was a neutral party, and there wasn't any reason to oppose it. So they snuck us in at the last minute. And so we are, the Kroc Institute has taken on this massive job of monitoring the implementation of the world's most complex peace agreement. There's something like 358 distinct provisions that we monitor. And we do regular reports on how those provisions are being implemented. And we do regular reports on specific elements of like the gender dimensions of the peace accord, or the efforts to disarm. One of the successful parts of the accord is that the FARC guerrillas have been disarmed and are now they've been demobilized and are now being integrated to one extent or another into the wider community. So it's a very interesting and unique, and not many things are unique, but this is a unique effort by a non-governmental entity to play an official role in the peace accords.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Very interesting.
Hi, Powers. Oops. I live as an upwinder to the Hanford nuclear power plant, and the entire Hanford complex, which is going through I'm not going to say years anymore, decades of cleanup. Could you speak to some of the ecological costs that have come with nuclear weapons?
It's not an area that I follow closely, but clearly the environmental costs are tremendous, and they last forever. I'm working with the U.S. Bishops Committee that's drafting the first major pastoral letter on Native Americans since the late 70s, and that's one concern that comes up quite frequently. There's a lot of, quite a few of the negative impacts, either from mining uranium on the Navajo reservation, for example, or the nuclear testing, and Archbishop Wester mentions this in his pastoral, that how that nuclear testing has impacted on the Native American communities in New Mexico. That's just one example of a community that's been significantly affected by the nuclear industry, the nuclear weapons and the nuclear energy industry. But you would probably, living close to Hanford, you'd probably have a better sense of the details. And there are lots of the nuclear materials. There's just so much that needs to be done to deal with the nuclear materials produced by, both the nuclear energy industry, but also the nuclear weapons industry. For example, I mentioned the number of nuclear weapons that have been dismantled since the end of the Cold War, which is huge progress, but that also left behind lots of nuclear material that needs to be dealt with, just as there's a lot of nuclear waste from nuclear energy.
It's about $5 billion a year into our local economy. Our economy is doing great, but at a real cost and drain on the American taxpayer, and that is a issue.
Yeah,
huge issue.
Professor, Kathleen, do you have a question?
Well, this is okay if you don't want to address this, but I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on what's going on in Ukraine with Russia and NATO and the US, as far as what would peace building look like in that setting?
A colleague of mine, Marianne Kusmanov, who's a professor of politics at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., argues that one of the failures of peace building after the Cold War is we never had a reconciliation process like you had between France and Germany after World War II, and that was in Pax Christi International. Pax Christi played a key role in the reconciliation between France and Germany after World War II. But we never had that kind of a reconciliation process between the former Soviet bloc and NATO and the US. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because, well, what would reconciliation have looked like had we tried that? We did all kinds of things that were positive after the end of the Cold War. Lots of economic aid went to the former Soviet bloc. Unfortunately, sometimes we try to remake those economies in the image of the US, or and even a more capitalist version of what the US had, and some of that went very much awry because the communist apparatchiks ended up running major industries in places like Russia, and that was a huge failure that contributed to the situation we're in now in Russia, where the elites who were part of the problem became the richest people in the country. We helped write draft constitutions in many countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Sometimes we did that in a way that was, again, try to impose, for example, our own views of religious separation of church and state on countries where there was no tradition of that kind of strict separation of church and state, of the kind that we have in the First Amendment. But we promoted human rights and did a lot of things that were very helpful. One thing that I think we did not do, that was not helpful, was the expansion of NATO. I understand, because I worked on Central and Eastern Europe for the US bishops before the end of the Cold War on religious freedom issues. I understand why Lithuania, and the other Baltic states, felt the need to wanted to join NATO, Poland, and the like. But the expansion of NATO clearly contributed to the rise of Putinism and undermined the efforts of Democrats in Russia to really develop the long-term process of democratic development that was necessary. Was undermined in part by the expansion of NATO, because it gave people like Putin the pretext and the argument to say that here we go again, we're being threatened by the West, and that's very real, and it gave him an opportunity to go back to kind of a czarist appeal to the old forms of czarist Russian nationalism that he has appealed to quite effectively, even though he's a communist apparatchik himself. So I think I think that has created some of the deeper conditions for the problems that we now have with an aggressive Russia and highly nationalistic Russia. Obviously, Putin and his cronies are the ones who are primarily responsible for their actions and their aggression. But I think we've handed them some pretexts that were not helpful. I don't know what the peace building approach is when this situation, when where there are masses of troops massing at the border, and you might have a military intervention, except to say that Ukraine has demonstrated in the past the power of nonviolent social movements and in overthrowing or pushing out authoritarian regimes and trying to build up their democracy. So if Russia were stupid enough to invade, and I think they would run into some massive, they would certainly run into some violent efforts to resist, but they also would likely run into long-term civil disobedience and peaceful social movements that would seek to undermine their power or the power of any puppet that they put in place. That's a bit of a rambling answer, but I don't follow Ukrainian-Russian affairs closely anymore as I did back in 30 years ago.
Thank you. That makes sense. Somebody mentioned the Bay of Pigs and how we reacted when there's thought of Russian arms in Cuba, and so it makes sense the way the Russians are reacting to the expansion of NATO.
It's a tough situation because you can't acquiesce. If Russian invaded, they've already taken over Crimea, they've invaded Georgia, they're fomenting a conflict in eastern Ukraine right now. International law matters, and Russia is flagrantly violating international law. And so it's a tough situation the world's in right now, figuring out what to do. There's no clear peace-building answer at this point.
Thank you for your answer. I mean, that was great. That history, putting it in perspective. No, that was a great answer. Thanks.
What else is on your mind? What are some of your key concerns? What did I miss?
Is there any effort on the Catholic Peacebuilding Network that's focusing on Taiwan, and especially in the repercussions of the complete seizure of Hong Kong by Beijing?
Yeah. I didn't explain this, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, as I probably should have when we started, but it's a network. It started in 2000. We started talking about it in 2002. We formally began in 2004. And it consists of about 24 bishops' conferences, university entities like Georgetown's Berkeley Center, Notre Dame's Kroc Institute, Boston College Theology Department, and then Catholic Relief Services, Caritas Internationalis, which is the Vatican's sort of umbrella agency for all the Catholic Caritas agencies in the world, and Pax Christi International and San Egidio Community in the United States. So what we decided when we started this was two things. One, that we would not focus on US foreign policy or foreign policy issues per se, because we didn't want to replicate all the work that was already being done in Washington by Catholic groups of, all kinds of Catholic groups on foreign policy. Everybody's clear we didn't want to duplicate efforts. The second thing we decided is that we'd focus our efforts on a couple parts of the world where the Catholic Church was a major influence and and was playing a major role in peace building. So we decided to focus on the southern Philippines, Mindanao, the Colombia, and then the Great Lakes region of Africa. We've Burundi, Congo, we've done a lot in South Sudan, some in Uganda. So our focus has been intentionally geographically narrow. We have not gotten involved, say, in the Middle East, even though almost all of our affiliated institutions are involved in Middle East issues. And again, because we didn't see how we don't want to duplicate efforts. And with Taiwan and China, because of the situation, and the situation has gotten really bad in the last decade. The situation for religious freedom was improving significantly in China for a while, but it has now become very difficult. And so it really is hard to work with the Catholic community in China these days. Now, Hong Kong would have been a possibility. We just had the former cardinal from Hong Kong here a couple of years ago. But we haven't worked on that issue, I'm afraid.
No, that makes sense. And the Cardinal Zinn has left it unambiguously clear how he feels about
Yeah.
progress in that area.
Yeah. No, it's a real it's a real travesty and a tragedy what's happening in Hong Kong right now. And yeah, if China does in Taiwan what Russia is threatening in Ukraine, we will be in very difficult straits. You know, and that's where, in both cases, nuclear weapons will always be in the background, and it's that's a very risky, very risky and dangerous situation.
Oh, extremely. I was about to jump in there and comment back and say, you know, I've given some thought to the argument of putting nuclear weapons in Taiwan. And when it became obvious that nuclear weapons could just as easily be put in Venezuela or re-put again in Cuba, I said, no, this is just called escalation. This isn't a solution.
But with Ukraine, you know, decided to give up its nuclear weapons after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that was at the strong encouragement of the United States and Britain and others. And in return, the United States and Britain offered security guarantees to Ukraine. That was part of the bargain. You give up the nukes, and we'll give you security guarantees. I think there are plenty of people in Ukraine right now who think they should have kept their nuclear weapons, and that they would. And I don't know that would have kept Russia from doing what it's doing, because nuclear weapons really aren't always a deterrent, and they aren't usable militarily. And so, but the perception, I think, certainly is that by some that, you know, as bad as things get worse, that Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons. You know, so it's if those of us who are working for nuclear disarmament, this is not helping at all, and it's not helping to make the case. Unless we can find ways to resolve the situation diplomatically, which, you know, I think the Biden administration has been doing quite a bit to do that. Whether sanctions will work, I have a couple colleagues of mine who are some of the world's experts on economic sanctions, and they believe the sanctions, you know, the appropriate kind of sanctions, you know, maybe could have the right kind of policy impact on Russia, but who knows if that's the case. What else? What other concerns does the party have? What are some of the pressing concerns that you all have?
One of the things that's top of my mind is, because I work in the industry, is cyber warfare. And in the last week, there have been some reports that Russia has been pounding Ukraine's industries and businesses with cyber espionage, and that's pretty demoralizing. And we've seen it spill over in the United States in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
How do you handle that? And what does peace building look like in that arena?
Yeah, I'm afraid that we haven't addressed that question. Some of my colleagues in the Catholic Peacebuilding Network have. The Holy See has done a lot of work on cyber issues. They just had a big conference. The Vatican's Integral Human Development Dicastery just had a big conference on cybersecurity and related issues back in December. I don't know if you might want to look at that. I'm sure it's online, but that's one of a number of conferences and other initiatives they've taken on the cybersecurity question and the like. It's not something that I have that we as a CPN have gotten involved in. thematic issues that we focused on, the kind of cut across the areas where we're working are, the church's role in peace processes, mining, which I mentioned, and the church's role in transitional justice and reconciliation. We also, the other thematic issue has nothing to do with those places where we were engaged with the churches, the nuclear question, and we took that up just because the institutions involved in the Catholic Peacebuilding Network are, many of them have been involved in the nuclear issue, since the early 1980s or before. So that's the fourth kind of thematic issue, but we haven't taken on the cybersecurity question. Again, we feel like it's important to focus and not be too broad, to go deep rather than too broad. But there are others who are putting a lot of energy into that. A number of my colleagues at Notre Dame are doing a lot of work on ethics of cyber.
Yeah, I think why I mention that is because seem to be reaching a tipping point of mutually assured destruction in that arena, and that could offer an interesting replacement to nuclear power issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the two are starting to intertwine, and one replaces the other at some point.
Yeah, in not a positive way, I imagine you're.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What else is on people's minds?
Professor Powers, my camera's not working, but I was just wondering where did you say we could find your book on mining?
It would be on the if you just Google Catholic Peacebuilding and mining. I guarantee you there are not very many books on Catholic peacebuilding and mining.
All right.
It's by Routledge Press, ROUTLEDG, and just came out a week or two ago on the open access version. The hard copy comes out next week or this week, but it's also on our website, the cpn.nd.edu. You can find a link there. Our website is, if you're interested in Catholic peacebuilding, our website is not just sort of advertising what we do as a network, but we also try to provide a one-stop shop for information on Catholic peacebuilding around the world. Not all aspects, not cyber, not the Middle East, but at least on the issues that we focus on, those 4 issues I mentioned, and those 3 areas where we've been working: Southern Philippines, Colombia, and the Great Lakes region of Africa. So there's a lot of really interesting, I think, information there about what the Catholic community around the world is doing in peacebuilding, and it's mostly an untold story. And if you like to read the lives of the saints, you can read the lives of contemporary saints, because there are lots of amazing people doing amazing things, and all motivated by their Catholic faith in places like Congo and Colombia and Philippines. So
Thank you.
Related to mining, but maybe it's outside of your geographic focus, I was wondering, I'd heard that one of the reasons that we stayed in Afghanistan so long was because possible mining in Afghanistan. Do you know anything about that?
I would think that, I wouldn't think that's a major reason we stayed in Afghanistan. I think the major reason we stayed in Afghanistan is because we didn't want the Taliban and their versions of ISIS and Al Qaeda and the like to we didn't want a resurgence of those entities. I don't think were we also interested in their mining? I'm sure that was one of many interests we have, but I don't think it was a primary. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't think it was a primary interest. I think we generally wanted to stabilize Afghanistan and make it a stable democracy. And or at least a stable ally, and we failed in that. But I don't think that I don't think that was the main motivation, mining.
Thanks.
With the 2022 midterms, you kind of started out your talk talking about policy issues that, for instance, favored the big extractive technologies. Is there any organization that would be tracking candidates and their voting records related to peace building and policies that interfere?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly groups like, well, Network, the Catholic group Network, they would track. Now, they're not a political action group, so they wouldn't track candidates the way political action groups do. You know, and they don't spend most of their energy on foreign policy issues, but you know, they might. I don't know if they're doing that right now. I haven't checked recently. That's a really good question. I can't think of a peace building organization in the narrow sense that would do that. You know, track political candidates. I can't think of any political action committees that, you know, usually it's the political action committees of one kind or another do that, and I can't think of any political action committees who are working on peace building.
Maybe that should be an effort of the American Solidarity Party using our platform to rank candidates.
Yeah, you would be more in a position, I think, to do that than a lot of the peace building groups tend to be they're all nonprofits, and they some of them are tied to churches, and so you really it would just not fit well with their mission to, you know, get into that kind of political candidate tracking. It becomes too partisan, or at least perceived as too partisan.
You mentioned earlier about, you know, you raised the question, what do Catholics who are parts of these industries do? You know, and that raised a question in my mind: how involved, if it can be involved at all in this, but how involved is the Archdiocese for the armed services?
I think it's safe to say that and this is public, that the Archbishop, I mentioned that some bishops in the United States and Europe were not pleased with the Pope's kind of black and white condemnation of nuclear deterrence. And one of those would be the Archbishop for Military Services. And he's expressed his concerns publicly, I believe. So they would, you know, and I know that some of the military archbishops in Europe have also, you know, shared some of those concerns that the Pope's been too black and white about nuclear deterrence, and you know, whereas you know the pastoral letters issued by the U.S. bishops in '83 and the German and French bishops, for example, had a more nuanced interpretation of the morality of nuclear deterrence. They all took slightly different positions on that. And the U.S. bishop's position is probably the most well-known, the strictly conditioned moral acceptance of deterrence. Some of the concerns are coming. They're not only coming from some of the military archbishops, but that certainly is one place where you're seeing concerns. I think there are different interpretations of what the Vatican's position is, frankly. And you know, one view is that this is just the in principle condemnation of nuclear deterrence. You know, finally, nuclear pacifism, pure and simple. Some of the Pope's language certainly would fit that, and not just Pope Francis, but his predecessors. A second interpretation is that and all these interpretations might be partly true. Second interpretation is that the Pope and other senior Vatican officials have been speaking in hortatory language in order to have the kind of political impact that they want, which is namely, especially to support the UN ban treaty that has now been ratified. A third interpretation is the one that I embrace, which is that the Pope has not taken a in-principled position against nuclear deterrence, but instead has applied the strictly conditioned moral acceptance of deterrence formula that was enunciated by John Paul II in a speech to the UN in 1982, and then elaborated upon by the US bishops. But he's applied those criteria to the nuclear signs of the times today and since the end of the Cold War, and made a prudential moral judgment that the criteria were not being met. And therefore that the nuclear deterrence, the existing nuclear deterrence, not nuclear deterrence as in principle, but the existing nuclear deterrence today are immoral because they don't meet the strict conditions for the moral acceptability of deterrence, which is that you don't use the weapons for war fighting, you have a minimal necessary to deter, and that deterrence is used as a step toward nuclear disarmament. And there have been lots of Vatican statements since the end of the Cold War saying that those conditions were not being met. And instead, deterrence has become a permanent condition, not a step toward disarmament. And that's my interpretation of what the Vatican's position is. And I don't think Pope Francis has departed significantly from his predecessors. He's just been in his, as he is wont to do, he's just been a little more clear and cut and dry in how he talks about it than, say, Pope Benedict, who said very similar things about nuclear deterrence. So that's a long-winded answer to a question, but that's my take on the Vatican's position. My short version of my take. Brian Keeney, did you want to jump in? Or? Anybody else? Any other thoughts, comments, issues that you want to discuss?
One of the issues, I think you mentioned that you had colleagues who were specialized in economic sanctions, but I was wondering about what your thoughts on Afghanistan and how the U.S. government has freezed some of freeze the Afghan assets because the Taliban are in control. And I was wondering, given the real economic hardships of the population and the starvation that's actually happening over there, what your thoughts are on that.
I don't have any strong opinions. I do know one of my former students was a diplomat for Afghan government, and he's still in the United States with his family, and he had a heck of a time figuring out what to do, given that all the assets of his office were frozen. So I've seen, I've heard, individual perspectives on exactly what the hardships, and he's not suffering in the way that people in Afghanistan is, because he's here in the United States. He has lots of support networks. But clearly it's having a terrible impact. But you have this real dilemma that you've got a number of leaders, the top leaders of the Taliban many of them are war criminals. They're on the UN's list of terrorists and war criminals. We have to think, you have to be careful about giving them access to huge resources that are not going to be used to feed people in Afghanistan. They're going to be used probably be used to to continue to strengthen the Taliban's hand and to repress anyone who opposes them and continue their violence. So it's a really hard call. How to deal with that, the question of, the frozen assets, but also the aid. I think it's a really hard call. But you gotta find way. I believe there are ways that, I understand there are ways that humanitarian agencies are finding to get aid in, and there are some exemptions that are being made, I understand, but exemptions, humanitarian exemptions, as we saw in Iraq in the 1990s, humanitarian exemptions to what is in effect a complete embargo don't work. They save a few lives, but you can't embargo a whole country for any period of time without a lot of people dying and suffering. And so I think you need one thing. My colleagues are experts in sanctions. They help write the book at the UN on sanctions. Is that you need targeted, you need smart sanctions that are very specifically targeted at key people or key sectors, and are targeted in a way that have clear criteria for lifting them and clear policy objectives. But blanket kind of effective embargoes of countries, I think are morally unjustified. And if that in fact is what we've got in Afghanistan de facto or de jure, then I think it's hard to justify morally. But it's a really tough question given who's given the leadership and who will take advantage of those resources if made available.
Thank you. Should we have a last call for any other questions? All right, well, it's been a very enlightening evening, and unless anybody else has any questions, I want to thank you for taking the time and coming and just encouraging us with your presence, but also and your words of affirmation for the party, but also giving us good insight into just a Catholic approach to peace building.
Okay.
So,
Well,
thank you
I
very
really
much.
enjoyed it, and thanks very much for having me, and enjoy your dinner.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Professor Powers.
All right.
All right.
Take care, everybody. Nice to meet you all.
Nice
Thank
to meet
you.
you. Have a good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.